last time on Elizabeth I, and since she had no children, the crown passed to her cousin through her Aunt Margaret, who married King James IV of Scotland. By the time Elizabeth died, James IV's great-grandson James VI was King of Scots and was invited to become King James I of England. James moved immediately down to London and visited his homeland infrequently afterwards. He managed to avoid being blown up in the Gunpowder Plot and was succeeded by his son Charles I. Charles was a king who didn't like Parliament, as he thought they restrained his power, and Parliament didn't like him, so a civil war broke out in which the king eventually lost his head. For 11 years, there wasn't a monarchy, only a republic ruled by Parliament, well, Cromwell. But once Cromwell died, and his son was seen as a little useless, Charles's son, Charles II, was invited back to the throne. Charles was the merry monarch, and had loads of illegitimate kids from lots of mistresses. He never had a true heir through his wife, so his brother, King James II, or 7th of Scotland, took the crown when his brother died. He was, however, Catholic, and since the Reformation, in which England became a Protestant country, Parliament didn't like the idea of a Catholic king, and forced him out in favour of his daughter Mary II and her husband William III, who also happened to be a grandson of Charles I. Mary died from smallpox, and William continued as king until he died from injury sustained from falling off a horse. Mary's sister Anne was the next monarch, and she wasn't able to produce a living heir, so Parliament had to decide how to set the succession after her, as she was the last in line. They based it on the closest Protestant heir to the throne, which happened to be the granddaughter of James I. She never lived long enough to see the crown, but her son George did. George I spoke German and no English, and was the king during the first Jacobite rebellion. He was succeeded by his son George II. He was also the king during the main Jacobite rebellion of 1745. His grandson George III took over, and this king lost America and then went mad. His son became regent during his father's illness, and this gave him a taste of the monarchy before he became King George IV in his own right. George was very indulgent and spent a lot of money, and he died leaving no child as heir, as his daughter had died in childbirth. There was a rush from his brothers to ensure an heir could be found, and in the meantime, his brother William IV became king. When William IV died, he was succeeded by his niece, Queen Victoria. Victoria is of course best known as the Queen of the British Empire, and being known as the Grand Matriarch of Europe. Having 9 kids, most of them were married into European royalty, and of course she was well known for wearing black after the death of her husband Prince Albert and mourning for 40 years. Her son, Edward VII, became king and signed a treaty with France, the Entente Cordiale, which would eventually bring Britain into World War I. His son, George V, was king when World War I happened, and he had to change the family name, which at that point was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, to Windsor, to sound less German, to keep the royal family going. When he died, his son, Edward VIII, took to the throne, but Edward was rather a playboy and wanted to marry a double divorcee called Wallis Simpson, which wasn't a done thing in the 1930s, and he was forced to abdicate, and his brother George VI became king. George, who had a stammer, was king during World War II, and when he died in 1952, he was succeeded by the present Queen, Queen Elizabeth II. If you have been watching, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. Now, this one, I'm sorry, I have to say this, otherwise I'll get it out. I won't have it any longer. Oh, this is going to be so rude. So, yep, they're here today, the living history guys, talking about the 13th century, 14th century. Thomas Randolph, the man who got granted this castle by Robert the Bruce, is being represented here today. And it's all about about the life and what they did in that time period.